afternoon. Psychology is such an amazing field of work and you can do so many exciting things. So today I would really like to share with you some practical examples of what JvR Consulting has done as part of our client solutions offerings. When we work with clients, we follow a very simple model which is called the M3 model, and it consists out of three basic phases: the map phase, the measure phase, and the mobilize phase. If you think about the process in a logical step, you would always have to start with map, which is all about understanding the context of what the client is working in, understanding their situation, understanding what it is that they're experiencing, where are they going, and also where they have come from. Only once you've mapped and you understand what the scenario looked like and what it should look like, can you then start to measure. So measure is all about assessing the environment and or the individual and then reporting on it. And then can you mobilize? And that is where you can start creating and proving value, closing the gap to get to the original desired phase. The beauty of this model, however, is that it's not a start and a stop model. You can at any time start with the measure phase or with the mobilize phase. And it is a circular model that you can continuously, once you've mobilized, identify a new area or identify new gaps in terms of map to then remeasure, remobilize. I would like to share with you this afternoon some examples of what we've done in each one of these phases in the recent past. So I'm going to start off with map, which is all about understanding context before you can create that value. In the world of JvR Consulting, competency frameworks and competencies are a very important part of what we do. And we honestly believe that competencies, behavioral competencies, underpin everything that happens within human capital, right from career and succession planning to managing performance, training and development, reward, recruitment and selection, and even culture change. Now, in order to understand competencies and competency frameworks, we need to just create a center definition and a place from which to start off with. So I would like to share with you what we view as competencies and how we define it as an organization. So a competency is then specifically behaviors that are required by a job incumbent to perform and function with confidence. We utilize the definition of Potgieter and van der Merwe that was established already in 2002. Specifically then, looking at competency potential, which is the next logical step, is where we say that is the sets of behaviors that are instrumental in delivering these results that are required. And we specifically view competency potential as the results of the use of psychological assessments, such as personality or cognition assessments. Once you have the potential, you can also then start looking at the competence of a person. So whether they actually have the ability to demonstrate those competencies that you've identified as essential to perform in the job. Once you now understand what competency potential is, if you look at the old age model of the iceberg model, you then see that competence are all those displayed behaviors that we can see above the surface. But below the surface, there's everything that sits that we can't see, and that's typically the potential that we refer to. Now, in our world, we refer to the 3 A's, which specifically refers then to ability, aptitude, and avidity. Aptitude are those inherent things that we have, our personality, our motives, our values. Ability are the skills that we've learned that we can use to actually then display competence. And then when we talk about avidity, it's particularly that drive, the enthusiasm that you use to just go for life and go for opportunities. So it also can be seen as ambition. So in JvR Consulting, we specifically, first of all, what we did is to set a baseline and identify typical behaviors or behavioral competencies that are important across industries, across different levels. And we developed our own framework, the JvR Africa Competency Framework, which consists out of 7 competency domains. And then within those domains, we've unpacked it to include 20 competencies. Those vary from analyzing, which will include things like strategic thinking or analytical thinking, to the domain communication, which includes verbal communication, change and stress management, which will look at things like adapting to change and coping with pressure, and then also influencing which includes negotiating and persuasion. So 7 domains, 20 competencies that you are then able to measure the competency potential and displayed competence of an individual. Within this scope of MAP, so as you can see, competencies are very important. So we do quite a bit of work with client competency frameworks as well. Right from building frameworks from scratch to just enhancing frameworks that currently exist. So one of the examples that we've recently done with one of our clients was to look at building a framework basically from the beginning. And the approach that we took was to really understand what their current assessment data is saying about the individuals, but to also then look at what is required. So we followed both a quantitative and a qualitative approach. In terms of the quantitative research, it really was looking at the assessments that they currently used and to see what does high performance in their leadership roles currently look like. And if you look at the example, you will see that in this case, they were generally people that were calm and untroubled. They liked change. So already you can start hearing that behavioral competencies like adapting to change would come out, or coping with pressure. They did seem, however, to be less comfortable using negotiating and to change other people's views. So constructs like persuasion was not something that typically was essential for high performers in leadership positions in this organization. We then followed the quantitative data analysis up with a qualitative approach. And what we did there was to do qualitative interviews and visionary interviews with the whole ExCo team and a layer of senior management. And we really asked them, so what is it that you currently have? In this case, they said they aligned with what we found in the data. They had people that critically evaluates information, that sets demanding goals. We then also looked at what research is currently saying, thinking about Industry 4.0, the fourth industrial revolution, Management 3.0. And we said, so this is in order to exist in the future, what you might be required to have. And then as part of our interview process, we also said, given what you think we have, what you say we have, given what the research says we need, what is it that you as an organization think it is that we need? So draw us that picture, map for us what a leader should look like that will take this organization into its next life cycle phase. Based on all of this information, we then did qualitative and quantitative analysis, and we built them a specific framework of which you can see the output, focusing on specifically 3 broad domains, talking about leading results, leading people, and leading self. So a well-rounded leader in this organization will be able to lead the business. So they will be able to apply business analytical thinking, think strategically, make decisions. They will also have to focus on people, where they will have to use influence. They will lead others and they will plan and take ownership. But also they need to lead themselves and focus on themselves in terms of how is their interpersonal effectiveness? Do they have personal mastery, and can they adapt to change? So that's the process that we would typically follow when we build a competency framework. But we also sometimes get asked to enhance frameworks as part of a bigger process. The next example that I would like to show you is actually part of a bigger process, and that is where we also then followed the framework development up with building an assessment center exercise, which I will later share with you. So in this case, we first had to then understand what the framework looks like, but also expand on the framework. We had focus group with subject matter experts in order to build the framework, but also to build the exercise. We then designed the exercise, piloted it, and then we'll implement and roll out. But when we specifically look at the competency part of it, to understand what those behaviors would be that we measure, we really had to understand what their framework consisted of. They had an existing framework that has been rolled out into the organization and has been in a working condition for many years. And you can see some of the examples of that. There's 14 competencies currently. They each have their own separate definition, but there was no behaviors underpinning those definitions. So before we could even start with building the exercise, we then had to build the examples of the behaviors that we would typically look like. And that's what you would typically then see on the screen now, If you look at building effective teams, you can see that the definition is about blending people into team, creating morale, energy, and spirit, fostering and leverage collaborative relationships within and across these teams. So therefore, typical behaviors that we would look for is to see if someone can mobilize a team into action, if they can encourage the team members to work towards achieving goals, if they can organize the team to work with other teams, and also if they can create a positive team morale. Just 2 examples of what we do specifically in the framework space. Moving on to the measure phase is now where we start assessing and reporting. So we typically also include individual feedback as part of our measure phase, unless it moves into a coaching type of discussion, because then we would start mobilizing the individual. But simply to provide feedback to an individual on how did you perform on your assessments, we still see as part of measure. At JvR Consulting, we specifically focus on how we can measure a person, and we use 6 different categories to measure both competency potential and competence. So when you start measuring competency potential, there's 5 areas that you can measure, and those 5 categories are then personality, cognition, counterproductive work behavior, emotional intelligence, and values and motives. Once you start doing competence assessments like in-baskets and role plays and competency-based interviews, we refer to that as competence assessments, and that is where you start measuring the actual competence. So now you are also then able to marry the 2 and see this is what's below the surface. Does the person have the potential to actually show us competence? And then, yes, they have, or no, they don't. And by splitting the 2 results out in our reports, it allows for a much richer development conversation, which I'll show you some examples of just now. In terms of our framework and these categories and what we can measure, the JvR Africa framework is currently underpinned by 19 different instruments that's available on the market that are mapped to our framework. So each of these 19 instruments may have multiple dimensions that they measure, and these dimensions are mapped to the framework. Each of these assessments or dimensions that's been mapped has its own set of strengths, development areas, and development action narratives that has been written in competency language. So it's not a case of taking a bullet in the report and pasting it into a competency report. It is reading the instrument, understanding our competencies, and writing those dimensions into competency language so it speaks a language that is applicable to both individuals, candidates, and line managers. So we're in essence taking psychological content by using psychological assessments and making it into everyday common work language. So we are expanding the field of psychology, if you think about it. If you look at the report outputs that's then available, we currently have 3 types of generic outputs that is focused on an individual. You have a dashboard report, which is simply a graphic representation of how the person performed in terms of the competencies, and then it will have a summary of strengths and development areas. That is based on their performance on the competencies. So in none of these reports will you find a section that says personality, and then it has a summary of what the personality assessment said. It is all integrated into the competencies. You do have the option of saying, I would like to have an executive summary that is written by a psychologist, and one of our consultants will write that summary for you, in which they will then start making mention of things that came out in the personality assessment or in the counterproductive work behavior assessment, but still in an integrated fashion. There's no way that you will be able to see and say, oh, this was copied from a different report. The second report that we then have, and these reports build on each other, is the descriptive report. So the descriptive report will include the graphic representation of the competency performance, and then we'll move into a section where we have detailed strengths and development areas per competency. If you choose to use counterproductive work behavior, those areas will be reported on separately because they may or may not impact on the specific competency. Always good to know when you do start seeing those behaviors, what is it likely to look like. Building on the descriptive report then is what we refer to as the development report. And that's where we now take it even one step further to say, you can see the summary, you can see the detailed strengths and development areas, but you can also now start seeing development actions in relation to each of these competencies. The beauty of these three reports is that they are all dynamic in terms of their text, because the text that has been compiled by our psychologist teams is not based on just the competency. It's based on each single dimension from every single assessment instrument that has been linked to the framework and has been written in a competency fashion to speak to the competency. That means, in practical terms, myself and candidate X might both on strategic thinking score similar in range on the competency. But the text that we receive might differ, because if I think about my personality assessment A, dimension A could look potentially much different to what dimension A on candidate X looks like. And that means our text will differ. So you can immediately see how the development discussion will also look different, because I will focus on different things than candidate X. So the narrative's completely dynamic in these reports. That's just in terms of the generic reports. Some of the other things, and in terms of reporting what we've done. But we don't just do reporting. We've also worked on bespoke reports, and I'll show you a couple of those now. So you'll see some of the other offerings that we have. We are currently revamping our 360 survey to change that. We have a competency-based interview guide that is available. We develop assessment centers, bespoke assessment center exercises, and we also have a skills profile that we make available as part of our succession planning offering. Specifically, when we start looking at the competency-based interview guide, just as an example, the guide consists out of the 20 competencies that is included in the JvR Africa framework, and each competency then has a set of questions, behavioral anchored rating questions, and you then simply score on a simple 4-point scale where you indicate whether the person has development required, coaching required, whether they are competent, or whether it's an area of strength. In order to gain access to this interview guide, there is a half-day training required just to familiarize the client with our competency framework and to also just take them through the basic principles of competency-based interviewing and the ORCE principles that we utilize. In terms of the 360, what you can currently see on the screen is just some outputs that we are working on. So our 360 is a little bit different to some other 360s that you typically find available on the market, because we particularly focus on a dual view. We don't just want to see how frequently the person displays the behavior, but we also want to see the quality at which the person displays the behavior, because we believe that you get a much richer view, because you can often display the behavior all the time, but the quality of that behavior is really poor. And the conversation is then much different to what you would have if you just simply knew that the person always displays it. You would almost infer that the quality would be good. So if you look at the first graph, the combined view, that is where you will get a view of how you performed on each of the competencies in terms of frequency and effectiveness. So if you use strategic thinking as an example, you can see that the person typically displayed strategic thinking and the behavior surrounding strategic thinking often, yet the quality of the effectiveness was not really all that great. If we then go to the identity versus reputation view, it is where we now see, if I think about the frequency, this is how I see myself. I'm quite close to how direct reports see me, because you can see there's an overlap in terms of the circle. There's a little bit of a gap, very small, minor gap between how peers view me, but there's a major discrepancy between how I view myself and how others view me and how my manager views me. So now you can already start seeing how you can align your conversation to see why is there this discrepancy between some of the reputation and the manager's view and my own view, my identity. And then if you start looking at the detailed results, you will now start seeing per behavior that we measure, per question, what does those discrepancies and alignment look like between myself and the other people that rated me. If we then start looking at bespoke reports, this specific example is where we show you displayed competence versus competency potential. And two specific areas that I would like to highlight is if you, for example, now look at business analytical thinking, you can see that the person's potential score much higher than their displayed competence. So imagine yourself having a development discussion with this individual. It's all about saying you have a potential, you have those underlying traits and preferences that can really make you a great performer and that you can show us these business analytical thinking behaviors that we require. Yet the current level at which you show it to us is not there yet. So now we know we need to put in specific development and learning and training activities to get the potential to match the competence. Where if I look at planning and ownership, I can see that the displayed competence is slightly higher than the potential that the person showed us. Very interesting conversation to now say, you've already taught yourself skills and coping mechanisms to display these things. So you're actually doing it very well, but the preferences are maybe not always there. So how do we help you to cope with the demands that you have to display the behavior? So two very different development discussions that you will likely have with this individual. Another view that you can take on potential versus displayed competence is a simple 9-box matrix. So we've identified 9 boxes in terms of moving from mismatched talent all the way to prime talent. And you can see in this example where the individual was plotted in terms of emerging talent. You will then provide the line manager with this person is emerging talent. It has a conclusion to say they showed us displayed, they showed us some of the competence or some of the behaviors that we required, but not all of it. But they showed us very high potential. So there's a lot of potential, but the skill is not there yet. So it means that we need to consider development and training actions. And then we can even link that back to readiness to show they are likely capable of progressing to the next leadership level in a certain amount of time. That's just examples of what we can do in terms of bespoke reporting. Getting back to the first example that I showed you when we spoke about building frameworks and building assessment center exercises. In this case, we built an exercise for a client, and this has been focusing on the process that the exercise would look like. So you would start with a welcoming and introductions. You would then do 4 exercises. So this specific assessment center exercise that we built included 4 different exercises. You first had to start with an analysis exercise and produce a written document at the end of the day. So it's a day in the life of exercise. The second mini exercise within the center is then to have a development discussion with an employee. Next, you would attend a best practice forum group discussion where you would have to get to an outcome around how to best manage performance across different sites. And then finally, you would have to present all the information that you had to analyze throughout the day to your general manager and come up with what is a way forward, what are the main problems, and how do we address them, what are my action plans. What we specifically did in this case is to then semi-automate the scoring in this exercise, where you have your behavioral anchored rating scales and you rate the person. They either did not display the behavior, they partially displayed the behavior, or they fully displayed the behavior. The importance here is that you have to provide evidence for each behavior anchored rating scale to justify the rating that you have given the person. So if you mark that they did not display behavior, you would need to indicate why did you say that? And then at the end, provide us with a summary of the strengths and development areas per competency, per exercise. The reporting output then is where you can see the person in terms of their competency potential, how they perform and how they stack up in terms of the competence. You would then get a summary per competency in terms of what behaviors did they not display, what did they partially display, what did they fully display, and you will also get a summary of what their demonstrated competence looked like in a table format. The last solution that I would want to share with you then that we've recently built is what we call the skills profile. And that's specifically as part of our succession planning modules that we roll out. Often it is to now measure. You don't just want to see what the displayed competence is in terms of behavior, but you also want to know, is this person able to speak a different language? Let's say it's an international organization. We want to deploy them from South Africa to France. So we want to see who is French speaking in the organization locally. Or maybe this person has completed multiple degrees, but we only know that they have a law degree because they work in the legal department, but they could potentially have completed a financial degree. So we could very easily, when we start having development and career planning discussions with this person, deploy them into finance. So this is what the skills profile is all about. It asks you about who you are, what are the things that you can do, but also to tap into that avidity component. What is it that you are interested in? What is next for you as an individual? So where do you see yourself going in the future within the organization? That's all the things you can measure. If you now take all of this information with the assessment results, you get to where we mobilize, and that's where we start creating value. So some of the things that we did is we often do thematic analysis. In this particular case study that you're currently seeing, we did a thematic analysis of just over 2,000 people that completed both focus groups and surveys to determine what was the EVP alignment within the organization and their EVP offering. So you can see in this case, we divided it into specific groups to see where are there overlap between the groups. 4 groups that we identified: those people that have tenure of between 1 to 6 years, those people that joined less than 12 months ago, and those people that's been with the organization for more than 10 years. And specifically in this case, the organization wanted to also see what is the millennials in the organization saying, what is most important for them in terms of EVP. And you can see that there are some overlap. The 7 top ones just tend to differ in order of priority. So some thematic analysis that we can do. If we then start using assessment results to now start looking at the mobilize, and how do we, once we start developing the individual, we can also then start comparing individuals to each other and also look at the organization at a group level. So I would also like to share with you some examples of how you can look at the different views. If you look at the individual talent view, in this example, you can see that we've now compared the individual not only to their current role, but also to 2 other levels within the organization. So we really want to see what career progression for this person would look like, and what areas would I need to develop to make sure that a person goes from a manager level to an HOD level to an executive level one day. So we're really working on the bench strength to follow a natural process for the person to grow in the organization. So you can see in this example, on a manager level, there's some development areas required. On an HOD level, it's actually the person is already showing us a potential area of strength. And on an executive level, some development would be required. The beauty of this is that the behavioral competencies stay exactly the same, but the weight that they bear is different on the different levels. So now you can start seeing you don't have to look at different behaviors. You look at the same behaviors, but some behaviors are more important on different levels than on others. Once I know what the individual looks like and I can start moving the individual into different areas, I can also start comparing the individuals to each other. So now you can typically see there's 2 individuals and I can see how they stack up per competency and potential and displayed. You can also get a 9-box view in terms of when you start seeing teams or you start seeing groups of people within the organization, and you can easily plot people, or in this example, you can see that there are 3 people in the bottom left-hand quadrant. So in terms of how many talent risks there are, in this case, there are 3 talent risks. That means I need to go into those individuals and see why there are risks and how can I typically move them so that they move in terms of the 9-box grid as well. Finally, you are then able to also roll this view up into an overall view. So the overall view is really designed to provide a summary and to identify trends within the organization. You can use specific filters. You are then able to look at particular functions. You are able to look at different locations, and you can view information from these participants, but also view the organization as a whole. So in this case, for example, you can see how many people are ready in terms of the short term, the long term, or the medium term. What does display potential look like versus competency potential in the organization? Or you can filter it down per gender, per age group, and all of this can be customized per the needs of the organization. As I said, this is really a fascinating field. Psychology is a very exciting field, and I think we use the things that we do in a very exciting manner, which enables organizations and our clients to be ready for the future, and to use results in a different way. So thank you for spending the time with me, and we really appreciate the work that you've been doing with us to enable us to make these exciting journeys with you, but also hope that we will be able to make new journeys with you, and share some of our experiences to also help you to speak to your problems, to be able to map it, to measure it, and then to close those gaps and to mobilize and create value. Thank you very much.